Kia ora te whānau, ko Kenya aho, ko Ramogi te maunga, ko Wikitoria te awa, ko Apollo toku papa, ko Rispa me Jane toku mama, ko Luo toku hapu, teno ko Taihitanga toku marae, ko Dr. Irene Akinyi Ayallo toku ingoa. No reira tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this video presentation of my paper, which looks at or critically explores the place of religion and religious identity in social practice, particularly with ethnic communities living in New Zealand. And as a case example, I talk about religion, religious identity as a significant factors within African background communities. So in my introduction, I also established my own whakapapa that I am a migrant to New Zealand and been living in Auckland for 17 years now. And I come from an African background. So as much as this is sort of a theoretical presentation, but it's also based on my own personal experience as a migrant to New Zealand, someone from an ethnic background community, and particularly someone from an African background. So what are some of the key arguments in this paper? So obviously, I'm approaching this topic with full recognition or remaining fully aware that religion or religious identity is it's a hotly debated topic because people come into the debate with very many different perspectives as well as very many different interpretations of what religion is or what religious identity is. And also just to acknowledge from the beginning that although for the sake of this paper, I'm generalizing it to an African perspective, but probably the most accurate way of saying it would be perspectives, because even within Africa there are multiple perspectives and ideologies. But the bottom line is that what I'm arguing is that, you know, religion and religious identity is very significant. Is a very significant part of African people or ethnic communities, if you like. And like I said, I'm going to be using African communities as an example. And like I will explain later, that it's a significant factor because it's a way of life. It's part of culture. If you look at the significance of culture, religion is very much part of culture, intricately so, very much part of culture. And so it shouldn't be sidelined. I'm saying that we should not sideline it. It should be part of our practice, particularly for those of us who work in social practice, whether that be social work, which I am a social worker by profession, and also a community development, an area which I've also practiced as well. So, and again, in affirming this particular, the significance part of religion, I am not denying that religious has played a very unhealthy role or a dangerous role, and particularly in the marginalization and oppression of certain individuals and groups. I still do acknowledge that particular role, and later on I'll talk about I'll present on some of the factors, in my opinion, why this has been so. But again, like I say, that I'm saying that once we have that conversation, hopefully we can all still see that religion still remains a very significant factor, should not be ignored. And this argument primarily comes from a point of view that religion is very much part of African worldviews and very much a way of life. And this is very much evident if you look at studies and research done from within and outside the continent on African worldviews and philosophies. Religion plays a very big part of it. So in a way, this presentation is me is me and all of us having a courageous conversation, and particularly having this courageous conversation in the context of colonization and decolonization discourses. Because as I will talk about it, as I will explain in a minute, that within its this is a context that sort of informs and particularly has contributed to the sidelining of religion or the argument that religion should not be part of the public sphere. It should be more of a private thing, and we should not talk about it in, say, in a conference such as this. So, yes, so having a courageous conversations in the context of colonization and decolonization discourses, and also the immigration process, and particularly the changes that people experience in this process. So, some might argue that, yeah, okay, so religion is important within the African continent, but maybe once people move in the process of migration, then it ceases to be significant. So I'm going to be arguing that this is not the case. So its significance does not diminish with the immigration process. And also, within the context of colonization and decolonization discourses, I will be talking about and arguing against or negating the argument that globally or universally religion is out of the public sphere. Because often there is a perspective that says that, okay, well, if the significance of religion has not diminished because of immigration, then it could diminish solely based on the argument that globally or universally we are seeing religion more and more out of the public sphere. So these are some of the key points that I'll be talking about, but ultimately saying that considering and having a courageous conversation of all of that, that religion remains a socio-cultural and political reality for the majority of African communities, even with the immigration process, and therefore it's a key factor that should be considered by those of us who work in social practice, social work, community development, and you could include counseling in there as well. So one of the reasons why we really do need to have this courageous conversation, particularly in Aotearoa New Zealand context, where generally we could say that Aotearoa New Zealand context is a very secular society, but we're seeing that the face of New Zealand is changing very much. If you look at this particular statistics provided by the new ethnic Ministry of Ethnic Communities, we can see that this as at 2018. So this was based on census 2018 census. That 20% of the New Zealand population identify as ethnic communities, and out of that, 65,000 identify as African. So more and more multiculturalism is becoming the new norm or the face in Aotearoa New Zealand. So we cannot, and again, as a general principle, a lot of the ethnic communities are coming in, as much as some of the cultural perspectives do change. But one aspect of culture that doesn't quite change is the aspect of religion or the religious factor. And therefore, if not anything, we should be having this courageous conversation in the context of increasing multiculturalism in New Zealand. I am presenting on identity, and again, because we're talking about identity, but we're also talking about a group of people who have moved from one location to the other, or from more accurately, from one nation to another, has crossed borders. We also need to think about how that process changes identity, because some people could argue that, okay, fair enough, as I mentioned before, that some people could argue that fair enough, religion might have been important to these people in their continent, in the African continent, but what about once people move and resettle in a new context where say, for example, in the case of Aotearoa, New Zealand, a very secular society, does that change anything, or do things do remain the same? So first and foremost, I do want to acknowledge that yes, immigration does challenge the way we construct our identity. So the whole process of resettlement, so the migration process in 3 stages, particularly the resettlement aspect. So it does change the way people look, the way we look at our identity and the things that form part of that identity. However, I do so yeah, so in the process of migration, in the process of people moving countries, a lot of things change because people want to fit in. Um, Things change because things are not necessarily the same as they were in people's country of origin. So quite a lot of things change. But I do want to say that research that has been done with migrant communities, particularly with ethnic communities, do show that even though the way that we think about culture, the way we think about identity, is brought to question with the immigration process. But it's also shown that for ethnic communities, cultural identity, and that includes religion, is not bound to a geographical or a territorial place. So it's not bound by, say, for example, Kenya, where I come from. So my cultural identity transcends those geographical or territorial places. So yes, we do question some of what might be included in that identity, but it does not necessarily change completely. That's my argument here. So some people might, embrace hybrid identities in the process, or some people might still maintain. In fact, some research shows that for some people, upon resettlement, the cultural identity even becomes stronger because that's what people have to hold on to. So, in other words, that our attachment to or our cultural identity is not buried or is not removed, but we people do find alternative ways of defining themselves and continuing with whatever informs that identity, but just in a new context. So yes, I do acknowledge that the immigration process might make people question, and for practical purposes, I would say, would make people question a lot of what informs their cultural identity, including religion, but it does not diminish that, not completely. It does not change completely. People kind of just find a way of adapting or integrating more so integrating. So integrating in the sense that participate and become part of the host community without necessarily losing who they are, where they come from. So I'm suggesting that once we unpack once we unpack which I kind of have unpacked what's led to the sidelining of religion. So the colonial history, the dominant Western European Eurocentric worldviews, and of course acknowledging that when religion becomes an ideology, and particularly when it becomes a discourse of guarding morality and obtaining and retaining power, then it becomes unhealthy. So we do have to, so to understand the significance of religion in the African worldview, and particularly in ethnic communities where religion is an important part of life, we do have to shift our focus. We do have to shift our approaches to a more post-colonial view or post-colonial worldview. So again, going back to, not so much going back to the original, but looking at trying to reconcile how religion is actually defined, say, from an African worldview, from African philosophy, um, from an African way of being. So post-colonial, when you talk about post-colonial approaches or post-colonial framework and looking at religion or religious identity from this perspective, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's writing and one of the key theorists, so one of the key writers in post-colonial theology, particularly in Africa, talks about the concept of a grain of wheat, or decolonizing the mind. So Ngugi talked about the fact that particularly within the African continent, with colonization, we people were made to feel drop on the ground like a grain of wheat. So it's a grain of wheat is an analogy that it's recognized in most African communities because wheat is a staple food, is grown by many. So we all do know that when a grain of wheat falls on the ground, it produces something completely new, and that's what colonialism did to a lot of African communities. That people had to lose the wheat, which are the people had to lose themselves and become something completely new. Um, and Gugi says that we need to move away from that. And in moving away from that, we need to go back and look at some of the aspects, some of the things that really matter to people in this, or really mattered to people in that community that were sort of wiped away with colonialism. So when we look at religion, for example, or before we look at the key components of religion as understood in the African worldview, things that really matter for African community is that yes, it's a very much kinship culture, or if you like, oral culture. So oral not in terms of so much verbal, but in terms of the fact that things are passed from one generation to the next generation. So ideally things don't get lost. Whether those are symbols, language, they don't get lost. They are usually passed from one generation to another. The other very important part is the connection between worlds. So there is that connection between the present, the past, and the in between. So there is no, so when you look at it, how probably in the Western European thought, or even within us academics, we tend to have that very clear cut between the sacral and the secular. That's not a perception in the African worldview because the worlds are very much connected. So the present, what's happening now, is connected to the past, and it's also connected to that space. That we assume or we believe that there is a space between the present and the past. So there is that. It's a loop. There is that ongoing connection. The other very important aspect of the African worldview, and in a minute I'll explain how those are linked to day-to-day practice. The other very important fact is relationships. So the I-we relationships, or the we-I relationship, sorry, the we-I relationship. So in the African worldview, generally speaking, there is no I-we. It's usually we then I. Or what we call the Ubuntu ethics. So we say that I am because we are, yeah, not we are because I am. So again, some people have argued that, which is not a discussion for this paper, but some people have argued that, oh, does that mean that the individual does not exist? It's usually just the we, but that's not how we say it. It's sort of a reciprocal relationship. So it's not a one-sided relationship. So I am because we are. Without you, I don't exist, and without me, you don't exist. The Ubuntu ethics. So relationship is really important. And the other bit is sort of the realm of dreams, and it's quite a difficult one to explain. But it's sort of, we believe that the realm of dreams is what connects us to the created. It's sort of, if you like, that's what most people would call kind of spirituality, the unknown, or something higher, something higher. So in African thought and philosophy, that's the realm of dreams. That's the philosophy that connects us to something higher than us. So yeah, so the wholeness, spirituality, if you like, if I'm to use a language that we probably are all familiar with. So that's just kind of the spiritual aspect of it. And finally, the idea of community, which again is very much linked to the relationship part, the we and I relationship, is very much collective, and the harmony that comes with that. It's not the fact that we have to agree with everything everyone says, but to maintain the connection between the worlds, to maintain relationship, um, to maintain that connection to the realm of dreams, there needs to be that harmony. We need to work together to be able to maintain a balance, or to be able to maintain an equilibrium. So translated into a day-to-day concept, the key components that I just explained, this is what it looks like. Beginning with the self. So the self is not separated into individualized parts. So the self is not broken into the mental, the physical, the material, the way that, again, generalization here, but the way that the self tends to be divided in Western European thought. So in the African worldview, or in African philosophy, the self is one. So, and this is very much similar, having practiced in New Zealand, or having been in New Zealand for the last 17 years. This is very much similar to Tangata Whenua, particularly when we look at it from the Te Whare Tapafa framework. That, what affects the mind affects the body, affects every part of the person. So so again, that separation between the sacral and the secular doesn't really exist, because so if that existed, then the self would be divided, but the self is not divided, so it cannot exist in two different spaces. It exists in one space, and that one space includes everything. And that's the view of the world as well, that it's not dichotomous. It's not an either or. The either or thinking is not part of the African belief or the African worldview. So the separation between the secular and the sacred, the public and the private, is not part of the African worldview, or part of the African philosophy. And so when you look at it from that perspective, then we come to understand things like mental health or mental illness, which are very much connected in African thought and worldview. It's very much connected to the realm, so to the spiritual world. And so, if we understand this, then we probably won't be too surprised when we are working in, say, mental health, where a lot of Africans would still believe that, would still be very hesitant, to be honest, to go for medication, because to many people it's sort of they might generally see it as an imbalance in relationship more than something that needs medication, for example. Again, a very broad topic for another presentation. Again, so general health is about balance and equilibrium within one's spirit. So in the first instance, it's not about, oh yeah, I'm gonna get medication for that. It's about, let me look at the balance. Am I balanced? Is everything the mental, the physical, the spiritual, is my world in balance to begin with? And like I said, community is very much kinship based. So looking at it, say, within a family, and all these are religious aspects. It's part of the culture. It's part of culture. It's part of religion by the sort of the Western definition of religion. So it's very much kinship based, in the sense that people have their roles, people have their spaces within the community, and these roles and spaces are what guides relationships, sometimes what keeps the balance, what maintains the equilibrium. So if they are broken, then something goes wrong somewhere else. And this also includes, support for each other within families, within the community, and also and in times of health and sickness. That support comes from that view of community, that again the we and I relationship. It also guards, harmony with the environment and with nature, that we are caretakers. We are caretakers of each other, as well as the space where we exist, the environment. Because remember when I talked about the different worlds, so the environment is very much, and nature is very, very, very much part of that. And also, it also governs how we look at death. So I talked about in the African worldview, there is that link between the present, the past, and the in between. So in the African worldview, death is usually not seen as an obliteration from existence. You're not being wiped from existence. It's more of a transition. So you might hear a lot of when working with African communities, there is that belief that even though people are dead, they are not really dead. They pass on to what we call the living dead. So there is that connection between the living, which is probably us, and maybe people who have just passed. When people have just passed, and then after a while they now become the living dead. So we still have a relationship with them. And like Tangata Whenua, we see this a lot in how people name newborns. So they're usually named after somebody who's passed to maintain that connection. But there is so death is not so in a lot of African families we'll have memorial services probably every year, or however often people can afford, because death is a transition. It doesn't mean that someone has completely been wiped out of existence. They are still the living dead. If we look at it from that perspective, therefore, then religion and spirituality in the African worldview is about a way of being in the world. It's not about institutions. It's not about a particular person. It's not tied to a particular person, opinion leaders. It's about perception. It's about perceiving. It's related to experience of relating to the transcendence or God in as institutional religion define it. But in the African worldview, it's not necessarily referred to as God. So it's if you look at African literature, we have very many names for the transcendent, who is not necessarily the kind of the Christian God. So religion is a way of looking at the world. It's a way of perceiving. It's a way of interpreting the world. When things happen to us, it's a way of trying to explain what's happened. And it's also a way of maintaining certain values, attitude, ethics, and morals. So it's a way of seeing, it's a way of interpreting, but it's also a way of relating to the world in terms of accessing connections, maintaining those connections, living those connections, and also transforming those connections. It's just a way of being. So when we look at it from those particular three perspectives, that religion, in terms of instead of being defining it in a very narrow way as just institutional religion, that's not the case based on what I've just talked about. That's not the case in the African worldview. So religion is about perceiving, it's about interpreting, which it includes explaining why and how things happen, the values that are that we hold, things that are very important to us. And it's also about relationships. How do we access those relationships or connections? And not just accessing them, but how do we maintain them as well? And in that, there are also patterns of coping and adapting to situations or to those relationships. And also it's also about it's also about support. It's also about resilience and transformation. So if you like, it's more about when you look at religion from an African worldview, we're talking about at least 4 types of qualitative relationships, if you like. So it's a relationship between the people, between the person and their environment, the relationship between the person themselves and other people. It's also the relationship between the person and their world. So it could be the past and the present as well, and also the relationship between the person and whatever the realm that is beyond us. So the transcendent, or what some people may refer to as God. So it's much more than the institution, the institutional religion that has come to be regarded as the religion. Then, if religion for African communities or for ethnic communities is about perceiving, interpreting, and relationships, then it then applies that that's everyday life. The most common issues that we do work with or work with people to address in social work and in community development, we do need perception in education, we need interpretation in education, we need relationship in issues such as education, and other important issues such as health, food, social life, death and grieving, family, politics, social change, environment, social policy, abuse, trauma, and violence. So if that's what religion is, then it I can comfortably say that, therefore say that religion is an intricate part, should be included, or an African understanding of religion should be part of things that we do work with our communities to address on a day-to-day basis, and therefore a factor that should not be ignored. And to conclude, just to reiterate that I'm very much aware, and I remain aware of, as I mentioned, religion being used as an ideology and therefore as very harmful. So while I emphasize in this particular presentation or in this paper that religion is significant, but we still do need to be aware of the unhealthy religion or unhealthy views, healthy and unhealthy views of religion. So religion essentially, ideally within African thought, encourages people to develop a deeper sense of meaning, purpose, personal integrity, wholeness, and joy. Well-being issues that are at the core of social work practice, justice, or everything, social justice, everything that is at the core of social work practice. However, and not, like I said, I'm not kind of trying to give the view that religion has been perfect, or perfectly applied even among Africans themselves or among ethnic communities themselves. I'm also aware, I remain very much aware that even within those communities themselves, um, religious ideas have been distorted. So we also need to distinguish that when religion begins to cause inappropriate guilt, shame, and hopelessness, or to lead to the discrimination and marginalization of certain individuals and groups, then something needs to be done about that. That should not be we should be in a position to question that even within these communities. So I remain aware of those issues, even while I say that within African thought and philosophy and within African communities, religion remains a social capital, if you like, and a way of being in the world. And therefore, it's something that practitioners should really consider, and based on how religion is viewed from an African worldview or an African philosophy, not so it's not about institutions, it's not about particular people or opinions, but it's a way of looking at viewing the world, it's a way of interpreting the world, and it's also a way of relating to the world. So yeah, so when we are working with our communities, let us not ignore the place of religion. Thank you so much for listening.